Hello, everybody. Very good. Anna, how are you doing tonight?
I'd be doing good. There's
And
Trey.
whoa, an orange shirt?
Yeah, Phoenix Suns orange.
Easy there, Mr. Brightside.
You should have seen how I used to dress. I used to have highlighter yellow shirts, but I've toned it down.
Now,
I thought
did
you
you
were about to
ever
say that you
have highlights in your hair?
No.
Oh my gosh.
You never,
Nope.
okay, you never had like blonde highlights. That was probably a little bit out of your age range. See, when I was younger, everybody
Yeah.
had the frosted tips. Everybody wanted to look like Smash Mouth or something like that.
Yeah, that was
Guy
probably
Fieri.
Yeah, right. That was probably a little bit before when I really would have been aware of that stuff. So, but yeah.
Were you a cool kid, Trey? Like, were you one of the like happening?
No.
Well, if you were a basketball player, you had to be, right?
I wasn't really back then.
Okay.
So I mean, I've always enjoyed basketball and always played it, but I never really got decent until probably middle school into high school. So I never really I was a classic nerd. Um yeah.
I
And,
got I got bad news. I got bad news for you.
yeah,
Was is probably not going to cut
yeah,
it here.
is. Yeah. Yeah. Very true.
Just kidding, my man. Just kidding. But really good to have you here, Trey. I know that we've got this is a record for group coaching in the audience. So welcome to everybody who's here to. It's actually funny. We had somebody say that the way the event was named made it sound like you were actually going to be physically targeting outflow boundaries, like out in the field.
Oh.
Over here, we have a wild outflow boundary. As you can see, the air parcels are lifting up over it, causing increased vorticity and stretching.
I mean, I wish. I mean, so we're on the board for tornadoes for the year, and that was an hour and a half south of me yesterday, near Tucson. So of course, random stupid crap that Arizona does.
You know what? I'm going to actually mix things up a little bit. As all of you know, we do take questions usually in the second half of these, but I see we have a hand up right from the start. I see Magdump KY. That is a new name that I don't think we've seen here before, so I'm just going to go ahead and invite him up on the stage. We're going to roll the dice, and we're going to see where this leads real quick. Magdump KY, you are invited up to the stage, my friend. If they're going to come up, I'm not sure. Okay, well, invitation retracted, and okay, doesn't look like they're going to come on the stage. So Trey, if you would like to, I will pass the floor over to you and let us know what we need to hear to get started learning about outflow boundaries.
Yeah, so I thought this would be a nice little session to do. It won't be as involved as my last one where we had just a bunch of different visuals and whatnot. I'll still show some stuff, but this will be more conversational. Most chasers know that outflow boundaries are kind of the pot of gold, I guess you could call it. We hear that, oh, if there's an outflow boundary set up, chances for tornadoes are higher, but we're going to dive into kind of why that's the case, and then really how you should go about targeting these outflow boundaries, which boundaries are bad, which boundaries are good, how to identify them, and then how to approach chasing storms that are on outflow boundaries. Not going to be too in depth, like I said, but we'll cover some things here. You may know a lot of this stuff already, but hopefully there's going to be some new stuff in here as well. So if y'all have any questions, just shout them out in the chat, and we'll get to them here. But all right, so we'll start off, and let me see. I don't see.
While you're getting that ready, Trey, I'll just say, because we have had a few comments in chat so far, if you have anything specific in mind, or if you would like Trey to comment on a visual, we can always take a link. If you send a picture, we can pull that up on the screen. So definitely not adverse to visuals or anything like that. We just want these sessions to be a little more conversational. But yeah, if you have something in particular, like let's say a screen grab from a chase that you had been on previously, or an event, I'm not going to name the event that shall not be named when it comes to famous outflow boundaries, but I'm sure at some point we're going to talk about that. So if anyone wants a visual on that, we can bring it up too. So there's a lot of play in the line here, so to speak, a lot of flexibility with what we can do with these sessions. So by all means, if you have something in mind, you're sitting on the toilet on a Wednesday afternoon, there's a session coming up on Saturday night, go ahead and store that away so that way you can toss it into chat and we will definitely get to it and comment on it and have the coaches give their advice. So Trey, I'll pass it back to you.
Cool. And if you see any questions in chat that I miss or something, just interrupt me and we'll go from there. But yeah, so we'll just start by reviewing why outflow boundaries are good for supercells and tornadoes. Number one, they can provide a source of uplift and convergence at the surface that can allow for rising motion. So if you have very weak ascent or something like that kind of a setup, we'll talk about that a little bit more later, that you still need some, but if you have sort of a weakly force setup, you can still get storms because of an outflow boundary. You'll have surface convergence along that boundary, and you can actually get storms to fire up on the boundary. And so after the boundary is sitting there, and you've got a storm that is interacting with the boundary, the tornado threat's going to likely increase if the storm can latch onto the boundary, because there's enhanced low-level shear along outflow boundaries. So you'll have a wind shift usually along a boundary. For example, winds may be out of the south on the south side of the boundary, out of the southeast or east on the cool side of the boundary. So you have changing winds there at the surface. So that leads to stronger low-level shear along the boundaries, which we know is favorable for tornadoes. You can also have enhanced vorticity along the boundary. So enhanced vorticity is good for landspouts. Landspouts feed on boundaries. You can have landspouts without boundaries, but the vorticity that is tilted and stretched up from the boundary, from an updraft above, is the classic mechanism for landspouts. And they can enhance the environment locally when the background environment's not all that favorable for tornadoes. So you can have a day that might not look all that favorable for tornadic supercells. Maybe we have weak low-level shear, or there's just not a lot going on in the wind profile that would suggest that we might see tornadic supercells. But along an outflow boundary, you can actually have, of course, as we said, a stronger low-level shear. And that means that you, right along the boundary, can be a locally favorable area for tornadic supercells, even though the background environment as a whole might not be super favorable. And we've seen many of those types of things in the past. I do see a couple questions here in the chat, so I will start up here. Kazaki says, are there signs to determine if a storm is going to produce an outflow boundary? Visually, if it's outflow dominant, if you start seeing a shelf cloud, that's a good sign that there's outflow pushing out. And then on radar, we'll talk about here in a second how to identify outflow boundaries on radar, satellite, etc. So hold off there. And if you've already seen some of the modules, the radar module, we talked about this a little bit in episode 2 of that, I believe, how to identify boundaries on different sorts of tools.
And Trey, I'm sorry, if I could interject there real quick, just so people know, training module, what's that? If you are new to the Chaser Academy, we actually had a whole different setup with the way we used to have the Chaser Academy on the internet. We weren't on Discord. It was its own standalone website, and we created a lot of training modules. Now, we decided to move in the more live-focused direction, so you're getting these sessions on a regular basis from Trey and all the other coaches. But all of that other content that we had from the last year, we're going to be releasing on YouTube again as a marketing strategy for the next year. But we want to make sure all of you who are in this chat right now who are Chaser Academy subscribers have access to it. So at any time you would like, if you navigate over to the channels list on the left-hand side, swipe over, obviously, if you're on mobile, and then under the Chaser Academy category, you're going to see a channel called Legacy Content, and there is a link to a Google Drive folder in there. We've organized all of the content. There's Chase and Explain episodes, and there are training modules. So you have access to all that stuff now and forever. I mean, you could technically cancel Chaser Academy subscription and not have access to it anymore. But if you just save that link, you'll still have it even if you cancel. I probably shouldn't be telling you that, but I'm just trying to emphasize how much value we're giving you guys, and all that stuff is available as well. So Trey, go ahead and take it again.
Yep, exactly right. So yeah, those things we talked about basically why. So when a storm is going to produce an outflow boundary, you can see it visually if it's starting to produce a lot of outflow, but you can also see it on the common tools like radar, and we'll talk about that here in a bit. Jack asked, common area for outflow boundaries to happen in. I assume that means relative to the storm. but usually it's going to be out in front of the storm. You can have a complex of storms, a big line of storms that pushes out outflow in front of it, and then maybe down trailing off to the south or southwest. Or if it's just a single storm, depends kind of on the orientation of the storm, but it'll just come out ahead of it, usually out ahead of the forward flank precipitation core. And that's going to be your main source of the outflow boundaries that we're talking about in this case. You can have your rear flank downdraft boundary, or that rear flank downdraft goes through the storm, wraps around the mesocyclone, and hits the surface. That is not going to be your main source of the outflow boundaries that we're targeting for these outflow boundary setups. Typically, that's going to be usually these are going to be from large complexes of storms or a couple of large storms or whatnot that put out a lot of cold air, cold outflow, and that outflow just kind of sits out ahead of it once those storms dissipate. And yes,
Now, Trey,
yep.
so you said something earlier about the wind shift that takes place when there's an outflow boundary. Could you maybe help me personally, because this is something I always have trouble with, and I'm sure there's some people in the chat who would also benefit. How do you conceptualize or understand what that wind shift means? Like, what's the physical process that's taking place that causes those winds to back more to the south, or to the southeast/east?
Yeah, sure. So let me share the screen here, and I'll do a little bit of art for everybody, a little bit of drawing. So
One of
we'll
my
wait
favorite part of Convective Chronicles, by the way.
the drawings.
Yeah.
It's funny because I can't even draw a stick figure correctly. I am a horrible artist, but I can draw weather stuff okay. All right, let's see if this pops up here. All right, give it a sec, and then we will do the screen share. It's taking a couple seconds here. There we go. Everybody see the screen? All right, so let's see. So when we're talking about let's say we have a complex of storms here. So we have a complex of storms, a big line of storms. We'll just call that our storm, and we have our outflow boundary that's kind of surged out ahead of the storm. It's kind of trailing off to the southwest. And then the storms, so you can kind of imagine what the winds are doing here near the storm. Let's say we have out here is open warm sector. So we have nice warm advection ongoing, lots of warm moist air flowing up from the south. So your winds are out of the south. Basically, we'll just say for this example, they're out of the south. But what happens is when this cold air comes out of the storm or complex of storms, it's pushing out from the storm. So the winds associated with that boundary are going to be opposing the southerly winds to the south. And this is an extreme example of this. They can have different orientations and whatnot, but you can see that once that storm complex is gone, we're going to have differing winds that we have on the warm side of the boundary. Warm side over here, obviously, and cool side over here. So you can see that the winds are shifting right along the boundary. Winds are out of the south on the south side of the boundary, and they're out of the north or northwest on the cool side of the boundary. So that gets your wind shift going, and that's what allows for that stronger wind shear and vorticity along the boundary to take place. And we'll talk about some characteristics of boundaries that are favorable for this in just a second. But that's kind of where the wind shift comes from, and the winds are flowing out of the storm. The outflow winds flowing out of the storm are moving in a different direction than the winds that are on the warm side of the boundary. So that's how that kind of comes to fruition. All right. So let's see, stop sharing. All right. So I saw a couple other questions here. Is a landspout the same thing as a tornado? Yes, a landspout is a type of tornado. It just starts from the ground and works upward, and it is not associated with the rotating updraft of a supercell. But landspouts, yes, they are certainly tornadoes. Would love to hear you explain what a MAHTE is. I don't know what that is. MAHTE. I do not know what that is. I'm sorry. Please enlighten me. Yeah, I don't know what that is. So
the MAHTE.
Yeah, I have no clue what that is. I've never heard of that before at all. So Wyatt, if you could please enlighten me what that stands for, I would be very thankful.
Wyatt had some great sunset pictures earlier, by the way, that he dropped in the photos and videos chat. So shout out
Nice.
to Wyatt for that.
Nice.
Go ahead and bring Sanus Northeast Chaser up on the stage.
Sure.
It is your time to shine, my friend.
All right, testing.
Yep.
Okay. I was having a discussion earlier with someone, and he was insisting that outflow boundary or just cold air boundaries in general don't do anything for tornadoes, and that it's only the deviant motion and modified storm relative winds that increase the ingestion of horizontal vorticity that will helps with the tornadoes. And he points to Nixon et al.'s paper as as kind of the source for that information. However, I feel like while the paper discusses that like stuff like that significant tornadoes are more associated with, like, of course, like the trailing cells, the nudgers, the mergers, that boundaries could still play a significant role in significant tornadoes, especially in more drier environments like the high plains. But I wanted to ask you, like, how would you determine, in what case would either of those be more dominant compared, rather than just saying that cold air boundaries don't, the increased convergence from and wind shift from the boundary does nothing.
So you're saying whether or not when is deviant motion, etc., more dominant than the
When is that the
boundary?
more dominant factor leading to tornado genesis, as opposed to the wind shift and increased convergence along the boundary?
And are you referring to deviant motion of the supercell, meaning that it kind of turns right? Or are you talking about you're talking about that, correct?
If it like hits the boundary and changes direction slightly, or it starts zippering or propagating in a different direction?
I mean, every setup is going to be different, but the statement that boundaries do not influence tornado genesis is just flat out wrong. There have been a number of cases where, and Cameron has talked about this. I don't know if it's specifically in the paper. I know he talks about different boundaries. I'm not sure if in the exact paper he talks about the processes there, but I know he kind of differentiates between hail and tornadic stuff and whatnot. But the source of vorticity and ingested from the boundary is a source of vorticity and stronger low level shear. So if a boundary can anchor to that area, or if it remains on the warm side, or just on the cool side where the low level thermos are not too stable, we'll talk about that in a second as well, then you're going to have a better chance of producing tornadoes along that boundary. And we'll talk about, again, we'll review what kind of boundaries are good and what boundaries are bad here in a second. But the deviant motion, it's more so the boundary dynamics, I think. The deviant motion of the supercell, that comes into play with the boundary orientation. But the supercell either needs to anchor to the boundary, or it needs to be the boundary needs to be sufficiently diffuse on both sides, to where you have backed winds on the north side of the cool side of the boundary, but again, sufficient thermos for supercells to allow that to happen. But that's all based on the characteristics of the boundary itself. That has the storm deviance is a different process that doesn't necessarily have much to do with tornado genesis along boundaries specifically. If you're talking about events without boundaries, then you may be onto something there. How much deviance the storm has can influence the local storm relative felicity the storm is experiencing. So that can have some impact there. But if you're talking about storms specifically along a boundary, then the boundary is going to be the main source, as far as I understand it. So.
And I think Trey, he followed up. He said, according to AMS Journal, it's mesoscale air mass with high theta E, if that sheds any light, was present on 4/27/11. So obviously,
okay. I know exactly here. I know exactly what that is. I believe it's that. So in the southeast, a lot of times you'll get. I usually call it a marine warm front. I know it's probably just not a great name for it, and might not be an accurate name for it. But let me share the screen again here just to get a little bit of a visual. But yes, I've heard of this. I wasn't aware it had a specific specific title, but in a lot of the Southeast events, and it doesn't happen every time, and I haven't really seen it too much elsewhere, but you can get it in the plains. I've seen some events in the plains have these mesoscale air masses with higher theta E, or these secondary warm front, marine sort of warm front. And the term marine warm front that I use kind of comes from the fact that they happen in the Southeast a little bit. But let me wait for this to pop up here real quick.
And Trey, while you're doing that,
Yeah.
I see we had a question from Jen Kushner, and she, I think, was asking in relation to the beautiful piece of art that you drew earlier, where she wanted to know, so the boundary pushes the warm air up on your diagram, or maybe like what is causing that warm air to actually move upwards on the diagram?
Oh, so you're looking, basically that diagram is if you're looking down at the ground. So you're looking at a 2D representation. So up would be north, to the right would be east, to the bottom would be south, and then west. That you're not looking vertically at that. I'm looking down at the storm, like you're looking at a radar image. You're looking down at the storm. So it's not pushing up. That drawing was not to show that it's pushing up necessarily. It's just showing that you have winds that are coming out of the south. You can imagine that you're out of the surface. You're looking to the north. The winds would be at your back, and then the winds coming out of the storm are flowing, in that case, out of the north, let's say. So they'd be coming right at you. That's what I was trying to show in that case. So yeah, that was not a vertical diagram, but an outflow boundary kind of acts as a warm front.
Or right, as a wind at my back.
Thank you.
Jen actually brings up a really good question. Before you launch into what you have on the screen real quick, I have a real issue with this, and I have ever since I started learning by reading the SPC convective outlooks every day, watching channels like yours, reading papers from people like Cameron. I feel like there is sometimes a deficit of standardization with terminology across the meteorological landscape, where I've had some real aha moments where things clicked, specifically when I realized that this term and this term, which are said differently by different groups of people, are actually describing the exact same thing, or at least something somewhat similar. And that could have been avoided if we actually had like standardized terminology. So, boundary layers, planetary boundary layer, warm fronts, cold fronts, all this stuff, like it's all sort of living in the same space. And it can be a little intimidating and overwhelming sometimes for new people when they're trying to learn, to have to make the connection that 17 different things are all basically pointing to the same basic mechanism.
Yeah, that is a big problem in meteorology. A lot of things have multiple things that you can call it. Many of those terms are stuff that you'll really only see in textbooks and in journal articles, like this mesoscale air mass of higher theta E. Just call it a frickin' warm front. I mean, or just call it a warm air mass. I think that's where a lot of the disconnect comes from, and why people kind of can struggle with meteorology. And what I try to do on the channel is kind of simplify that stuff. I see a lot of people on social media, really very smart people who are really bright at what they do, but they tend to use these terms that are difficult for people to understand. And while their postings have a lot of good information in them, it's tough for the general public to understand. So that's why I don't like you said, planetary boundary layer. I try not to say like the boundary layer, just say the low levels or the atmosphere. It's just easier for people to, I think, comprehend sometimes. And then that goes the same here. Mesoscale air mass of higher theta E. It's just, so usually in a southeast setup, you'll have your warm front, you'll have your cold front, maybe a dry line back here, or pseudo dry line to the west, and you'll have your synoptic warm front. That'll be kind of the leading edge of the entire warm sector. But you'll have, maybe some 40s dew points. So these are dew points here. Maybe you'll have 40s dew points on the cool side. And you'll have, say, 59, 62, 63 dew points. So clearly your synoptic warm front's there. But you'll also have an area where there's a clear shift from these kind of dew points that are fairly moist two dew points that may be in like 67, 66, 68 range. So there's clearly higher moisture down to the south, but there may not be a notable wind shift with that because it's just, we're in the entire open warm sector. It's not necessarily an outflow boundary from earlier convection. I think this is what they mean by mesoscale air mass of higher theta E. It's just literally a secondary sort of pseudo warm front boundary that can act as a focus point for perhaps more intense severe weather. So it's not necessarily a boundary in the kind of like an outflow boundary in that kind of sense, where you have a clear wind shift, you'll have a strong temperature gradient across it. It might be very, very subtle, but your dew points across the boundary might be enough to where there's clearly some type of moisture gradient there. And these moisture gradients can cause circulations that increase low-level shear, increase uplift and whatnot, and you can get a focused zone of more intense severe weather very near that secondary warm front. And to the south of that, I think, is what the MATI is, I think. And I suspect,
so just to make sure I'm understanding that correctly, I see the little dotted line that you have drawn in. So those lower dew points that are further ahead in that sort of mass of air kind of gets overran maybe by the higher dew points back behind it, and that's what causes the lift that gives you more of a focused, concentrated area for storms right there with that dotted line.
Not necessarily. It may not be moving at all. It may be the leading edge of a secondary sort of higher air mass with higher moisture content. So it may be acting as a secondary warm front and actually moving. But there may not be a wind shift along it. But these temperature gradients and these moisture gradients, even if they don't have a wind shift, they can cause vertical circulations, and they can have that can allow for extra lift along that, and they can act as sort of boundaries similar to an outflow boundary, although they're very different in their characteristics. They can act similarly as they can have enhanced ingredients along it, even though we don't see a strong wind shift or whatnot. It's just a little bit of a moisture gradient. So that's kind of how it works. They're very subtle. You'll see it in southeast setups. So if we have big southeast setups this spring, keep an eye out for those secondary warm fronts, as they can be fairly favorable for an enhanced corridor of more robust severe weather. On April 27th, I suspect, I don't know if that would be the kind of the Hackleburg, Phil Campbell area in northern Alabama where you had that. I think that might have been sort of an outflow boundary from the morning stuff. I can't remember off the top of my head, but there have been many setups in the past where you've had this sort of secondary warm front and then that, I guess, mesoscale air mass of higher theta E to the south of it. And that's what that is, I think. So don't quote me on that, but that's how I'm interpreting that. So
our very own Top Goober, she wants to know what brought about the setup on December 28th, 2025, real quick, if you could sneak that in there.
What brought so that was a pretty strong trough. Nice defluence in the exit region, very intense jet streak. And there was the cold front. It wasn't a very it was fast moving, but you had enough of a window and enough shear vector perpendicularity with respect to that to have at least some window for supercells, and some supercells formed out ahead of the front. But yeah, there was strong low level shear. If you look at the 19Z sounding from that day at Lincoln, Illinois, there was very strong low level shear. Thermos were not great, but you had enough to give you some spin ups from embedded supercells, and there was a strong tornado, I think, as well. So yeah, it was very much it was kind of a classic Midwest setup, but the thermos definitely held it back from being a bigger event.
Shout out to Anna, by the way. Top Goober here. That was her first tornado ever.
Nice. Congrats.
So she was on it.
Nice. Very nice. All right.
And
anything else before I get back to boundaries?
Yeah, if you want to get back to boundaries, I'll go ahead and collate some more of these questions off to the side.
We do have Sanist, Northeast Chaser, once again, raising their hand. So I can take that before I go back to it.
Okay. Go for it, Sanist, Northeast Chaser.
Okay, here's the thing. This was another question in regards to boundaries, so I don't know if I should just shut up and wait, or if this would be a good segue to get back into it.
Go for it. We'll see.
I just want to ask, how did you know when, like, if you have like a boundary that's going to what's the best way to like look at something and tell like whether or not like a boundary is going to like help with your chances for a tornado. Like my favorite kinds of setups are those like high cape, low shear, drunken fist deals where boundaries more often than not can play a big role. And so I the first what I'm thinking of is like the Anson Hawley family, where that was like a real big thing that went from like kind of lackluster to violent tornado producer in a span of a couple of minutes. So it's like how do you look at something like in the beginning, either if it's something like that or if it's something like Wellfleet where the boundary's kind of in place and it's been there just kind of cooking throughout the day and you're just waiting for something to happen. How do you what's your kind of process for like looking at those kinds of days in the big picture and making a good guess of what could happen?
That's an excellent segue because that's exactly where we're going now. So I will dive into that. And if you have any specific questions on the process here, feel free to shout it out, but I'll probably answer these as we go along. So we're going to start off with what makes a good boundary versus what makes a bad boundary per se. So the types of boundaries you want to see, and these are more, so this is more so for pre-existing outflow boundaries. A Hawley case was a special case where you had the outflow boundary from the storm to the south. The left split to the south came up and it just stalled right there where that Anson Hawley supercell was ongoing. The storm latched and then all hell broke loose and the storm followed the boundary south basically. Kind of latched onto it, anchored to it, and the whole complex moved south. So that's a little bit of a different thing that we're going to be talking about here. And those you can't really forecast ahead of time. But it kind of does tie into what we're going to talk about here, what makes a good boundary. And the first thing is that it is slow moving or stationary. You want your boundary to be slow moving or stationary. That way storms can much more easily anchor to the boundary. Again, we're talking about storms. The best chances for when storms have a better chance of becoming tornadic is when they can latch onto the boundary. So basically they're moving, they latch onto the boundary, and then they track along the boundary the entire time. We'll talk about some cases where that's not the case and you can still get tornadic supercells. But in most cases, you want a slow moving or stationary boundary because your storms can much more easily anchor to it. You also want your boundaries to be diffuse. So that means having a very weak temperature gradient across it or a very subtle wind shift. In the example I showed earlier, your winds were out of the south in the warm sector and out of the north coming out of that complex behind the boundary. So that's pretty strong convergence there. A lot of times your best boundary is going to be if you have just like southeasterly or southerly flow, and then you have just a little bit of backing on the cool side of the boundary to maybe southeasterly. Those are the best boundaries. Again, more importantly is the temperature gradient across it. If you have a boundary where you have very warm air on the warm side, but you have very cold air on the cool side, that is not going to be a good boundary because that is going to allow it to continue to move and surge, which is not good, as we just talked about. So if you have on the warm side of the boundary, if you have temperatures in the 80s, maybe the mid 80s, and you have 50s and 60s on the cool side, that's not good. That's going to mean your boundary is going to be very sharp, and sharp boundaries do not work out most of the time. But if you have, say, upper 80s on the warm side and low to mid 80s on the cool side, that is optimal. And then you also want your storm motion to be relatively parallel to the boundary. So if you have a pre-existing boundary, you want your storm motion to be very much along that boundary so that the storms can, again, latch onto the boundary. What makes a bad boundary? If it never stops moving or if it's surging. And usually that is caused by that sharp temperature gradient, or if there's continued convective development behind the boundary. So that's a lot of time when you'll get these moving boundaries. If you just continue to get storms popping up on the cool side of the boundary, because they're going to continue to produce outflow in this kind of cycle, and it's going to continue to push that boundary farther and farther, and allow it to surge. And that's not good for storms latching on to the front. Any storm that is able to develop on the boundary is going to quickly move to the cool side and become elevated, which, as we know, is not good for tornadic supercells. If you have a sharp temperature gradient, if the boundary is sharp, meaning if you have a very strong temperature gradient across it, or there's very strong convergence along the front. Again, more important is the temperature gradient across it. And again, if your storm motion is cross boundary, so if you have your boundary and your storm motion is like this, well, storms are going to start on the warm side and very quickly move to the cool side and become elevated, which is usually not good. So we'll talk about how to, and then going back to the Anson-Hawley case, we did have some of those characteristics there because the outflow boundary from the left split to the south was moving pretty fast to the north, but then once it got near the Anson supercell, it basically stalled out. And so that allowed the storm to latch onto it, tap into that enhanced low-level shear and vorticity along it, and then it did its thing.
Right.
If
I could ask you a question, because you said something really interesting there.
Yeah.
Now, you said if a storm is moving and it's oriented wrong to the boundary, or the boundary is oriented wrong, then you can get that storm basically going over to the cold side, and that at bare minimum is going to make it elevated. Maybe it just dies off completely, right?
Mm-hmm. In most cases. There are some, we'll talk about a case where that's not the case here in a second, but in most cases, yes.
Okay, then maybe I am getting ahead of myself, so just tell me if that is the case. But I was just thinking, I feel like I've seen before instances where the outflow boundary itself can actually dictate the storm changing direction when it latches onto the boundary. Is that something that you would watch out for and maybe position yourself in advance so that you're in anticipation of that happening?
Yeah, it can. You can see more deviant motion with storms that latch onto the boundary. A good case would be kind of like the Anson-Hawley case, where the storm started to go pretty hard to the south after it latched onto the boundary. And that's more so just the supercell dynamics, not the boundary kind of modulating the motion itself. That's just the dynamics of the environment. There was very limited flow aloft. And a lot of times the outflow boundary cases are in these days where you have very limited winds aloft and not a ton of deep layer shear. And so that's when you have your photographs that are oftentimes more favorable for deviant motion. And your storms tend to go more off to the southeast or south. And that is more so what modulates that instead of the boundary itself. But in a lot of cases, a lot of boundary cases, you will see that it's that you will get more not erratic motion, but deviant motion, I guess, of the storm itself, oftentimes more to the south or southeast.
So that photograph where people are, where you're looking for a storm to be more deviant, is where you have, like you said, that very weak upper level shear, so you don't have a lot of steering influence,
Right.
and the low levels, whether that is the actual low level shear or just the boundary affecting the low level shear, have a much greater chance of actually affecting the direction of the storm.
Yeah, basically.
Okay.
Yeah,
And so that
it'll a lot of times it'll be those kind of photographs where you have a fairly short, maybe a little kink in the low levels, but it's fairly a short low level photograph. There's not a ton of strengthening of the winds in the low levels necessarily, so you get that kind of short, weak storm relative inflow that Cameron Nixon talks about.
okay.
And then that is more, and of course the low level shear is bolstered by the boundary. But yeah, in those cases you'll get your deviant motion a lot more. So yeah. Right. So how to identify outflow boundaries on different tools? So visually, you're not always going to be able to see a boundary visually, but in a lot of cases you might it will show up as kind of a line of perhaps more puffy cumulus, or just a line of clouds that is following where the boundary is, where that enhanced uplift is. And they might have a little bit more vertical development than the rest of the cumulus in your cumulus field. So I don't have any visual example of photographic examples of that, but you can imagine that you'll see kind of a line of a little bit more stout cumulus where the boundary is, and then on either side of that you might see cumulus with not quite as robust a vertical development, or maybe not even any clouds, much cloud cover at all. But that fine line visually is what you might see with your eyes if there were to be a boundary in place. And again, not all cases you will see the boundary, but in some cases you might. More reliable is going to be your tools like surface, OBS, satellite, and radar. So I'll share the screen here once again, and we'll show you a couple of examples here. All right, so for example, let's take a look at surface map here. Talked about you're going to see something like a wind shift temperature gradient across it, moisture gradient across it, and that's going to be your sign that you might see something like that. So let's go to the Chapman day. We'll start off with satellites. This was the Chapman, Kansas wedge, May 25th, 2016, the day after Dodge City. And this was a very low-end day at first. Didn't look really to be all that impressive, but you'll note that as we go into the morning hours, or the late morning to early afternoon, right there, you see that fine line in Kansas. That is a classic sign of an outflow boundary. So almost acting as sort of a warm front here. You had a little bit more stratusy type cloud cover on the cool side with nice surface heating and very limited cloud cover on the cool side. That is a classic sign. And you see kind of a fine line in there of maybe a little bit more stout cloud cover. That is your boundary. And this is an extreme example. They're not all going to show up like this on satellite, but this is a very good example of a boundary on satellite. And let's talk about surface here. So I'll go to surface ops, and we'll check the surface ops for that day. So let's go to maybe 16Z, 25th of May, 2016. And we'll do our station plots, and then we'll go Central Plains if I can. Actually, I'll just plug in. No zoom, moderate density, 7. All right, so this is going to be the surface map for about the same time as this satellite image. So our boundary's right in here. And you can see that we have evidence of a boundary right there on our surface data. So you see, again, we're looking for, just like we are for frontal zones, we're looking for wind shifts, temperature gradients, moisture gradients across the front, and you usually, across the boundary, and you usually want multiple of these features to be in place. They may be very subtle, but you usually want multiple boxes to be checked to have confidence in placing that boundary. So you can see we have a wind shift here. Our winds across much of the southern 2/3 of Kansas are out of the south, and more so out of the east or east-southeast on the cool side of the boundary. Even some northerly winds there where some storms were still ongoing. We also have a temperature gradient. Temperatures in the low to mid 70s down here to the south. Temperatures in the mid to upper 60s here to the north. So clear wind shift, clear temperature gradient, moisture gradient as well. Dew points in the mid to upper 60s here out across to the south of the boundary, hanging out right around 60 to the north. So it is a subtle moisture gradient, but it's there. So we have all those boxes checked. So we can, with confidence, pretty much place our boundary somewhere right in here. And it's not going to be perfect here. This is, of course, is a northeasterly wind, but you can see we have temperatures in the 70s there. So our boundary is very close to that point. Probably looks something like that. And you can see it kind of matches our satellite imagery there. The boundary kind of arcs across the sort of I-70 corridor right in there. So our boundary would be right in that location as well. So again, this is a fairly textbook example. They're not all going to be this obvious, but on surface maps, if you see wind shifts, temperature gradients, moisture gradients, you're going to be those outflow boundaries are going to be that outflow boundary is going to be well placed if you can check all those boxes. They're not always going to be like that though. So let me go here to another example. So this is going to be May 24th, 2008. So an early complex of storms moved out. And this is another kind of good example here. This was from the radar module. And I placed it in already here, but you can see why. Winds out of the southeast to the south of the boundary. Winds to pretty much easterly to the north side of the boundary. So clear wind shift, northerly winds here across northeastern Oklahoma as well. Temperature gradient, temperatures in the mid to upper 70s to the south, 60s to the north. And then a moisture gradient, dew points in the 70s to the south, 60s to the north. So this was a pretty sharp boundary, not always ideal. There were still some thunderstorms ongoing to the north of the boundary at this time. And in this case, you'd want to be looking for those storms to dissipate and that outflow boundary to stop moving. At this point, the boundary was surging a little bit, and you'd want to see it stop moving and lose that sort of sharp gradient across it for more of an optimal chance for tornadic supercells. And that usually comes in the form of surface heating on both sides. If you want to see surface heating on both sides of the boundary, in contrast to what we saw here in the Kansas case, eventually it did work out. We got surface heating on both sides, But if it were to remain like this all day and our boundary was very sharply outlined with stratus to the north and clear skies to the south, that would maintain that sharpness along the boundary, and that would not be an optimal boundary for tornadic supercells. But you can see here as we go into the afternoon, we get nice cloud breaks on both sides of the boundary. You can still see the boundary there with that fine line of cumulus, and you can see cloud breaks on both sides, and we were able to get temperatures on both sides of the boundary to be fairly similar, which allowed for a nice diffuse boundary. I'll go forward in time a little bit to 21Z. And sometimes you may not even see it on surface obs. It may be very, very subtle. So right here, you can see not a ton to tell us that there's a boundary there. The wind shift kind of goes away a little bit, but there's still a temperature gradient. Temperatures in the low to mid 80s to the south, 70s off to the north, and then the moisture kind of fills in as well, as this boundary is very diffuse. You get rid of that stratus on the cool side of the boundary, temperature's warm, the moisture kind of creeps onto the cool side as well. So really just left with a temperature gradient, and these can be some of the best boundaries where you have a very, very subtle wind shift, if any, and just a very subtle temperature gradient, but that boundary is still there. The remnants of that boundary are still there. The circulation along the boundary can initiate storms, and that low-level shear is going to be enhanced along that, where that circulation is. So those are going to be your best types of boundaries. So we talked about satellite. If we talked about surface obs, radar. Radar is going to be another tool that is going to be oftentimes very, very favorable for looking for boundaries. So, of course, here is an example of that. You're going to see a fine line along the boundary in reflectivity, and you'll see it on velocity as well. But because we have converging winds along the boundary, bugs and insects and whatnot get trapped in that zone of convergence along the boundary, and then they show up as radar returns. So they can let you, in some cases, easily pick out where the boundary is. This is, again, a very textbook case, but you may not see it as favorably on radar, but in many cases you might, and that'll show you. And the radar, of course, can show you very clearly whether it's moving or not in real time, basically. So that is how you identify outflow boundaries. And now we'll talk about some things to remember when you're chasing boundaries. So,
real quick, Trey, before you get into the ways, things to remember, those bugs that you talked about, and the birds, I guess too, but the bugs mainly, are they okay?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. When the boundary sweeps them up, they don't get like thrown into the meso of whatever storms pop up. I said that tongue in cheek, of course. I'm just.
It depends, I guess. If they get sucked into the updraft, then they might have a tough time. But
kind of like what a little kid would ask their parent, like, "Mommy and Daddy, are the bugs okay?" Like, you're just like nonchalantly talking about how the poor animals are getting sucked into the storms and.
Yeah. In a case like this, they'd be fine because it's just winds coming together. They would be totally fine. They're just trapped in the zone of convergence, and they're too small to get out. So that's why they get trapped in there. But yeah, they're totally good.
I see Asha saying that's such a me question. Yeah, it was definitely channeling somebody along the lines of my girlfriend. You'll see her be in the chat, but that's definitely the kind of thing she would ask as well. So are the poor bugs okay? So I was just trying to throw that out there for everyone. But all right, please, Trey, continue.
I see we have a hand up from Sanus Northeast Chaser again. So we can go there first before I continue.
Okay, well, actually, before I let him up on the stage, we have had a few questions build up as well over in our document.
Yep, go for it.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and read off some of those. I see we do have a comment from Wyatt Marshall saying that the phenomenon, we're talking about that mate or whatever phenomenon was present in the Hurricane Milton outbreak, if he remembers correctly. So I'm not sure if that would be something to look into if anyone was interested. UBNT with the funny comment, would enough Allsups burritos and the resulting surface heating with vertical lift theoretically help create a pseudo warm front? So I have heard about people, we'll say, assisting the inflow with their own moisture as a potential enhancement of the local updraft. And I'll leave it at that.
Yes.
Storm Chaser Jesse Smith, how are some boundaries more prominent than others? And it seems like I'm going to get this answered as I'm typing. So Trey is just that damn good. Apparently you answered the question before they even had a chance to get it up on stage here. So
yeah, it's just the diffuseness of the boundary. If the wind shift is very, very subtle, you may not see it come up on radar or whatnot. But if it is pretty sharp, you might have a better chance of seeing it.
Jen Kushner says, so all these examples you are giving, is there anywhere to learn more information about them, like on an NWS website? Trey, do you know any resources other than, of course, your awesome convective chronicles material where people could learn more about this?
Yeah, if you just type in outflow boundary, you'll probably get a lot of stuff out there on it. I'm sure NWS has some stuff. I do talk about some of this stuff more in depth in the old radar module episode 2. So if you have access to that Google Drive link and you can download that second episode of the radar for storm chasing, a radar 101 module, I talk about it and give some more examples visually of these things in there. So you may want to, that's a good, not a shameless plug or anything, but that is a decent resource. But yeah, if you just type in outflow boundaries on YouTube or Google, you'll find some good stuff.
And I do see a couple of results coming up. Trey, I'm sure you remember this website, but the weather prediction, Habe Hints.
Oh, perfect website. That website is excellent. So I highly recommend.
You know what? That doesn't surprise me at all. The website that still looks like it's living in 1997 is the one
Yeah.
that you find absolutely perfect. So.
Yeah, the guy, his name is Jeff Habe. He's a meteorologist from way back, and he does all those tidbits, and he does a fantastic job. So highly recommend his site.
Yep, Jen, I'm actually looking right now. I typed in Habe Hints outflow boundaries,
Yep.
and it looks like there are no less than 4 or 5 results that have popped up specifically from that site, theweatherprediction.com. I actually learned a lot of my meteorology stuff from him when I was first cutting my teeth. It's a great resource.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay, and then let's see. Greeny says, what about convective temperature? I'm not sure exactly what that is in regards to. Just as a matter of us being able to help you. If you put a question like out there, maybe try to just connect it to whatever we're talking about in the moment, because sometimes we don't see these questions until 10, 15, 20 minutes later. But Trey, if you want to take a stab, what would convective temperature have to do with anything on outflow boundaries?
So the convective temperature is most useful in setups where you don't have large scale forcing for ascent. You have very weak large scale forcing for ascent. You're really relying mostly on surface heating to get parcels at the surface buoyant enough to rise on their own and become updrafts. It's not very useful in those situations where you have a big trough coming in and a lot of forcing. It can be a somewhat useful tool, but in most cases, the best setups you want to use convective temperature for is for those weak force setups, which oftentimes are boundary setups, alpha boundary setups. So if that is the case, you have fairly weak large scale forcing for ascent, and you have an outflow boundary just sitting there. Again, the convergence along the boundary can help initiate storms as well. But if those temperatures near the boundary get to that convective temperature, well, those parcels now at the surface are now buoyant, and they can rise on their own, and that can aid the process along. So that is probably where that is going there. But yeah, that's basically just a quick overview of convective temperature, and it can come in handy on these weakly forced boundary setups.
I do see that Greeny chimed in with a little bit more detail. They ask, does convective temperature help with storm initiation in a capped environment? So right along the lines of what you were talking about.
Yeah. Again, it's for those setups where there's weak synoptic forcing and you're relying mostly on surface heating, like a dryline setup where you're just relying on dryline convergence and surface heating. We need those temperatures to get warm enough for those air parcels at the surface to rise on their own. That's what the convective temperature is measuring. What is the air temperature at the surface where those surface parcels can become buoyant and rise on their own? So that's those situations are where that's going to come in.
I see we have Jacob M. My therapist said I need to learn more about boundaries. Is this what she meant? Unfortunately, I don't think so. I would like to claim that meteorology and storm chasing could solve all your issues, but you're probably still going to need to at least go back for a few more visits there, Jacob. Apologies. Okay, Sanus Northeast Chaser. Going to bring you up on the stage now. Thank you for waiting patiently while we got through those questions ahead of yours. And the floor is yours, my friend. maybe it's not. Maybe it's not. Let's see if let's get Kazaki up here on stage. Saying this Northeast Chaser, if you hear this and are ready to go, just give Kazaki a moment here, please, to chat. We're going to bring them up on stage, and then we'll get you next.
Hey, Trey. So I know you had talked about what makes a good boundary versus a bad boundary. In a situation, where you have multiple outflow boundaries that exists, how do you decide? In that case, how would you decide which one, I guess, matters most? Like, which one would have like the greatest potential, going off of like, especially if you have multiple outflow boundaries that they look good, with all the things you talked about. How would you decide which one is the best one to go after?
That's a tough one. I cannot remember a setup off the top of my head where there were two legitimate outflow boundaries that you needed to choose from. I'm trying to think back if I can think of any setups that I've experienced where that was the case, but that's a tough one. I would try to hinge on those things that we talked about, those check boxes that we talked about, and see which one checks the most boxes. Which is one moving a little bit versus one that's stationary? What's the gradient on either side of the boundary? Is one of them sharper than the other? Then the sharp one may not be the best one to target. Does one have a convection that's kind of filling in along it already, and one's kind of just sitting there? It's tough. I don't think I've come across that in the field where I've had to make a choice between an outflow boundary. Of course, you can choose between different targets in a setup: outflow boundary versus warm front versus pure dry line and whatnot. And that can be, you'll look at things like storm mode along that, the profiles along that, wind profiles, which one's more favorable for tornadoes and whatnot. I always tend to hedge toward the outflow boundaries, though, especially, and that was going to be my first point with how to chase and some tips when chasing and targeting outflow boundaries. The cases that I've had the most success on are the outflow boundary cases where they're intersecting another boundary. So a dry line outflow boundary intersection where it forms that triple point, or something like that. Even if you have a weak cold front and a boundary. Those seem to be the best cases. Dodge City was like that, and I know we finally brought it up. Dodge City, that's kind of the prototypical outflow boundary case. But
take a drink.
Yep, take a drink. Yep. But that case was classic, and I can bring it up here real quick. But you had your dry line out to the west across southwest Kansas, and then you had an outflow boundary for morning convection that was intersecting that dry line right near the Dodge City, just south of the Dodge City area, and that's where things popped off. So you can kind of see it. So this is the satellite imagery there. This is in the morning, clear outflow boundary right there. And for some context, the dry line was out in here to the west. So I'll go forward in time, and you can see it, very subtle, but it's kind of just sitting there. We have a clear boundary between cooler skies, some of those stable rolls that we've talked about in previous episodes, out there to the north of the boundary, nice cumulus field to the south, and then your dry line out there arcing in southwest Kansas.
Sorry, we can't see what you're looking at.
Oh, sorry. I forgot to share the screen.
Thank you, Top Goober. Appreciate the save.
Yep, so here it is in the afternoon. Dodge City day. Here's your boundary. Cool air, slightly more stable air with some of those convective rolls, cloud streets, and then your dry line was out in here to the west, and that intersection point was right where the action happened. So that's kind of your prototypical dry line outflow boundary intersection case. And lo and behold, storms formed right along the boundary right there. And you can really see the boundaries fill in. Nice little line of cumulus right there. And then your dry line was right there. And right at that triple point was right where things popped off. So I always really like those boundaries that intersect another boundary like a dry line. Those are kind of the best, at least in my experience. So
Yeah,
but
Trey, if you could for a second, because I was really surprised to hear you say that for the first time when you mentioned that you don't really like chasing pure dryline setups. You
yeah.
highly prefer there to be some sort of boundary that is intersecting with the dry line, and that's when you feel like the real magic happens. If you could maybe take a couple of minutes and walk us through that.
Yeah, I've had surprisingly very little success with pure dry line setups where you're just relying on the dry line to initiate storms. There's no other outside mechanisms. There'll be some synoptic forcing maybe, but there's no other outflow boundary or anything. I've had very little success on those days, and we've had plenty of setups that have gone off with just pure dry line. May 17th, 2019, the McCook, Nebraska day, Southwest Kansas day. Separate target there. That was a pure dry line case in Kansas. One of the rare cases recently where it's popped off like that. Let's see. I believe April 19th, 2023 was the Oklahoma City area cyclic supercells in the evening, the Cole Part 1 day. I believe that was pure dry line. But back in the 90s, we had a ton of these events, like June 8th, 1995, the Pampa and Kellerville day. But I've had very little success, and I don't know what it is. And you can get storms on dry lines, pure dry lines. I chase tornadoes, and I've found that it's very difficult to get pure dry line setups to produce tornadoes. I don't know why that's the case, but it seems like you more often than not need that extra oomph from like an outflow boundary to enhance the low level shear, to enhance because what also happens with those outflow boundary dryline setups is you have that triple point there where the boundaries are intersecting. That maximizes the ascent and can really focus where storms are going to initiate, as we saw in the Dodge City case. So it kind of helps things get going, and then along the boundary, you can get the really intense low level shear that can let things pop off. But in a pure dryline case, that's hard to come by. So that's kind of where that comes from. There have been several pure dryline cases in the past, but I've seen good storms on pure dry lines, but from a tornado perspective, I've had very little success with pure dryline cases. And I tend to favor more of your triple points or outflow boundary dryline intersections. Like a triple point warm front or dryline warm front intersection. Those are what I tend to focus on now because of that extra ascent along them and extra low level shear. So that's where that comes from.
And for you to say something like that really tells me that I should be giving a lot of run room for these setups that have that intersection going on. So I'm definitely going to be paying a lot closer attention in the future when I see something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. The day that comes to mind for me is May 26, 2021, the Benkelman, Nebraska day, when everybody and their mother was in the moderate risk on the dry line in western Kansas, and nothing happened. And then the triple point up north just went ham up in Nebraska. That was kind of the last time I swore off targeting pure dry line setups because of that day. I actually think May 18th this year, 2025, may have been a pure dryline case down here in the South. So that was the one case where I've had decent success with a pure dryline. Was the Arnett day this past year. But other than that, I've had it's been tough tornadoes have been tough to come by on pure dryline setups for me, at least.
Really interesting how interwoven our fates are. I don't think you and I have ever talked about the Binkelman Day, but that was a day or two after Selden, correct?
Yeah, May 24th was Selden, so 2 days later.
Yep, 2 days later. I remember that day. I actually remember talking to Cameron Nixon in a parking lot at, I forget the gas station or whatever, and I was like, I don't know, man. Like I'm thinking of going up to the triple point. And by the way, this is not like I shouldn't have listened to Cameron. Everybody was on the southern target that day.
Oh yeah.
So yeah. I remember watching those towers go up, and then they died almost as soon as they started to launch up into the upper atmosphere. And so I had at the beginning of the day planned on targeting the triple point in Nebraska, and I was like so pained watching everybody get that amazing tornado up there.
Yeah, that was kind of the day. I was my last year with Howie in Raxpole, and we were that whole stretch. We were looking forward to that day because it was synoptically evident for a while. We thought it was going to be a great dryline day. Thank God, Selden happened, and we got our kind of crowning achievement of that year in the Selden data set. that we've now published some papers on, because that we were in western Kansas too. I remember we were sitting near Scott City, I think, initially, and once I saw that deck of cirrus come over, I knew we were done. We talked about that in my last session, and I showed a picture from that day, May 26th, when I talked about cirrus being a bugaboo, fly in the ointment. That was that day, and you could just see that thick cirrus deck moving over, and I knew we were done at that point. I've never had a great day when there's been thick cirrus aloft. So yeah, that was tough to swallow, but thank God we had the Selden data set to work with, or else that would have been a pretty disappointing stretch for us.
I'm gonna pull Sanus Northeast Chaser up on the stage, even though Greeny was technically ahead of them, because Greeny is trying to figure out how they want to, or I'm sorry, I accidentally pulled Greeny up. Are you ready to answer your question, Greeny, or do you want me to wait and have Sanus Northeast Chaser come up first?
Because he raised his hand first, I'll let him he can go first.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and put you back in the audience. Just raise your hand again and I'll get you next.
All right.
Okay, so Sanus Northeast Chaser, you are up on the stage again, my friend.
The first one is kind of the first one's kind of a short one, and the second one's kind of a long one.
Okay.
The first one is, you said that like how insects will get swept up into OFBs and will kind of get dragged along, and that's what shows up on radar. I always thought it was just if you had like a particularly strong OFB, or I guess sharp OFB would act as a little area of enhanced lift, and actually that it was just small, just very small, faint areas of precip. So is that like something that could happen?
It's mostly going to be particulates, and that'll include insects, maybe some dust particles, stuff like that. That's what mostly happens. You can have precip along a boundary, but as far the example I showed with the pretty fine line boundary near the Midland area, that was there were clear skies around that boundary, and so that when you have when that's the case, those will be insects or dust or something that gets caught in the area of convergence along the boundary, because the radar, in order to sense something, it has to bounce off of something. So in those cases where it's clear skies and you just have the boundary, it's going to be dust and insects and whatnot.
And then the second question is in regards to like the kind of positioning of the boundary with regards to storm motion. There's in one of the videos, I don't remember which one. I think it was either one of the radar fundamentals. I think you said that you wanted boundaries to be mostly positioned as being closer to perpendicular to the storm motion, so that it wouldn't end up tracking into an area of more stable air, but would kind of like ride along it. I'm thinking of like the Wellfleet day, where that was where you kind of had the boundary was kind of like draped down, mostly north-south. There was some east-west orientation, and then the storm kind of came off, and then the storm pretty much stood still. Was that mainly, you would say, worked well because the initiation was probably like terrain induced, and the upper level winds were rather weak, and if it was and that if you had stronger forcing and the storm was actually moving, it would start to have issues with that?
Yeah, exactly right. So you can have a boundary that's not necessarily oriented properly, but if a storm goes up along that boundary or near the boundary and it's not in the boundary stationary, but again, it's oriented improperly. If the storm is stationary, it goes up near the boundary. Well, that's a good thing too, because you basically have very little storm motion. It's just sitting on the boundary. So that's exactly right. And a lot of times those terrain-induced cases, your upper level winds are going to be very weak, so your storm motion is going to be very limited. So if that's the case, then you don't really need to have your boundary oriented any which way. You just need to have a storm that is stationary in the vicinity of the boundary, and it's going to do the same thing. And I'll show a case here in a second where it's kind of similar. it'll be a Silverton case, and it's a little bit different, but the boundary was not really oriented all that properly. But there's a difference. We'll talk about the thermodynamic characteristics on either side that makes it favorable. But yeah, if your boundary is not oriented properly, but you have a storm go up on it, you need the storm to be stationary, and then it works out.
All right. Adam asks, in regards to the surface boundary, or the surface map that was shown with a temperature difference indicating the outflow boundary, but lacked a wind shift, how can that be differentiated from a differential heating boundary? Would you use past radar and satellite loops? Thanks, gentlemen. Thank you, Adam.
So basically, an outflow boundary is a differential heating boundary. Differential heating boundary is kind of the umbrella term, if you will, where you just have so some differential heating boundaries with no other source. That can happen from, like, say you have cirrus overspread anvils from a storm complex in some location, and you have clear skies to the south along the edge of that anvil overspread. That can be differential heating. But an outflow boundary acts as the same thing. That these boundaries all act in the same way. You can think of an outflow boundary, especially if it's fresh coming right out from a storm, as like a miniature cold front. Cold air is pushing out, and it's lifting, forcing air upward over top it. And then once it stalls, you have that remnant circulation, and then the wind shift along it provides that continued source of extra lift. But it's basically the same. There is really not really much differentiation with those. An outflow boundary usually is a type of differential heating boundary. So in all cases, those are going to be pretty good for storms as well. Differential heating, it's sometimes tough to get a true differential heating boundary with no other source to do the job. But there have been cases in the past, like the May 3rd 99 case was an interesting case where the hole opened up in the cirrus, and you got a little bit of differential heating there on that secondary dry line kind of thing. So yeah. And specifically, he's referring to that case that we talked about, the Chapman case in the afternoon, where it kind of lost its wind shift. It basically acts as a differential heating boundary in that case. So yeah, you would use radar and satellite. Same things. All boundaries you can use radar, satellite, and surface obs to figure out where those are. But for the purposes of storm chasing, a differential heating boundary and an outflow boundary are going to act similarly, in as far as initiating storms or tornado potential with supercells that interact with them.
Very good. And Greeny coming up on stage, it looks like is the last question that we have in the queue. So Greeny, my friend, you are good to go now.
All right. So this one, it can go with pretty much kind of anything with plains storms, but I was also thinking about like how boundaries usually supply not only a way for storms to initiate, but it can supply vorticity. But I was also thinking about low-level thermodynamics, particularly 3-kilometer Cape, because out in the Midwest with things like cold core, or maybe even in Dixie where you have your setups, 3 Cape can really, dictate whether storms produce tornadoes. But in the plains, you usually don't have as much low-level instability with like 3 Cape. Usually you get a lot of mixed layer Cape, but you don't have, the low-level Cape for it. So I'm kind of wondering what, how storms work in the plains compared to the Midwest when it comes to that, because, if you were to have a thermodynamic parameter space like in the plains without much 3-kilometer Cape, like further east, you might not get a tornado. But in the plains, all you really need is that boundary.
Yeah, that's a tough one to answer because theoretically storms should pretty much be the same almost everywhere, but we know there are differences between how southeast storms act and how plain storms act. I think a lot of it has to do with the wind profile. A lot of times in the Midwest, you get setups, of course, that have these Mongo parameter spaces, but in the plains, you're often dealing with pretty good parameter spaces. You have big Cape, which that's what we're talking about here, 3 Cape and whatnot. Or you have, if you don't have strong extreme instability, you often have a pretty strong low-level wind profile. In the Midwest, more times than not, more often than not, I think it's more you get these kind of unidirectional wind profiles or wind profiles that aren't as favorable. So the kinematics can kind of overcome the sometimes lack of 3 Cape in the plains. And you don't always have those kind of kinematics out in the Midwest. Of course you do. There are plenty of setups where you have, but in a general sense, you usually have to things have to be just right in the plains or in the Midwest to get really good setups. And in the plains, it can work differently. And in the Southeast as well, you just get these kinematic profiles that are a little bit different, I think. So I don't know. It's that's a tough one. I don't exactly know if there are any legitimate characteristics that are super different between how supercells actually work in those areas. But that would be my hypothesis on there. It's just more so because when you have limited low-level thermodynamics, your kinematics can help overcome that. So I think it would have probably something to do with the wind profile and the kinematics in those places.
All right. Let's see here. That completely clears out the queue. We have about 12 minutes left for this session, so we'll call it 9:25 Eastern time. So do the math for your time zone. We'll take questions until that point. But Trey, while we're waiting on those last few questions to roll in, I did have a couple of questions for you that I've been jotting down here along the way. So a lot of times when we're reading the convective outlook, let me turn my camera on. I forgot I turned it off. When we're reading the convective outlooks for the day 2, a lot of times it will talk about an MCS rolling through or something like that that may produce a lingering outflow boundary. So number 1, how is it that they can tell ahead of time if there's going to be an outflow boundary in place? Like, what about the models actually gives them that confidence? And then number 2, what do you want to look for with the evolution of the convective system from the previous night through the following early morning to see if that outflow boundary is actually going to materialize, or perhaps if you might need to position yourself differently? Because I could see a scenario, like for instance, the one that we talked about earlier with the Binkelman day, where you could say to yourself, if there's 100% going to be an outflow boundary that's oriented somewhat perpendicular to the dry line, then I want to be there chasing that. But if not, I'll take my chances on the southern target. So how would I go about balancing all those factors?
Yeah, those are good questions, and that kind of segues into my last few points about how tips for targeting outflow boundaries. That is a tough. So how the outflow boundary behaves through the morning and overnight and through the morning of your chase day, that oftentimes is more of a wait and see deal. We can tell ahead of time on the models using cams and whatnot, and looking at our finer resolution, larger scale models like the NAM. You can look at the surface depiction, the surface winds, and surface moisture and winds, and see kind of where any boundaries might set up. Where has there been rain cooled air that has dropped the dew points, dropped the surface temperatures, and you can tell if there's sometimes a wind shift as well. But where those temperature gradients are, that may be where the boundary is. And with cams as well, we can kind of see how the radar estimate of the radar moves through the day, and see kind of estimate where it's going to set up. But as we know, those are not always correct. And usually that's going to be those outflow boundary setups are really often wake up and see type days. You have to see how the MCS is acting through the morning. What you want to see is that MCS dissipating with time. You don't want to see that MCS staying strong, or like we talked about, initiating convection on its flanks, on its southwest flank, that is behind the boundary that continues to keep that outflow cycle going and continue to push the boundary. You want to see all that convection behind the boundary dissipate. Those will be environments with lots of convective inhibition, or it runs into some drier air, or the forcing kind of outruns where the squall line is. Those are good signs for when your MCS is going to dissipate with time and your boundary is going to be able to stall. But It's usually a wake up and see thing. We can get an idea of the models ahead of time based on what we can see at the surface and with cams, but a lot of times it's going to be you have to wait till the morning and see how that MCS acts. If it persists longer than we expected, then that might not be good. If it dissipates when we thought it was going to continue to propagate, then that's a good thing for potential later. So it just kind of depends on the setup, and it's usually a wake up and see deal with those kind of things.
Very good to know. And it looks like we do have a few more questions rolling in. So we'll start with Zacharologist. I like that name a lot. Very nice. What happens or is likely to happen at the tail ends of an outflow/weakening section during storm interaction? What about converging boundaries, leaning more on outflow to outflow? Apologies if this has already been asked or covered. I'm not entirely sure, but Trey, you probably have a better idea of what Zacharologist is asking here.
Yeah, so the tail end of an outflow during a storm interaction. So I assume that it deals with a supercell that's kind of interacting with the tail end of a boundary. It depends on the characteristics of the boundary. Is that a really sharp boundary? Is it surging? Is there a lot of cold air, say from another storm complex that's where the boundary is emanating from, and it's just pushing that boundary? Then you're going to have a real quick time for that storm to spin up as it interacts with the boundary. But if that boundary's again not moving and the storm's interacting with it, then you can get some longer duration things to happen. But it depends on the characteristics of the boundary. As far as converging boundaries, so when you have multiple boundaries kind of coming together, it's classic in the monsoon season when you have really highly outflow dominant setups. Those are going to maximize your chances for storm development because you have basically two cold fronts coming and interacting with one another, two wedges, push brooms coming at one another and forcing that air upward with high efficiency. So you have a very good chance of storms actually initiating on that. And a lot of times you'll see that in the monsoon season. And when you have over the Phoenix metro area, and there's often a little bit of a capping inversion just because where we sit in the city and whatnot. And so you may not have storms ongoing around you, but if you have two outflow boundaries colliding, you may get really intense pop-up storms right where those boundaries intersect, and then they'll die off pretty quickly. Usually those involve boundaries that are moving. So very fast moving boundaries. This means that you have strong cold air, lots of cold air on on the cool sides of both of those boundaries. So that's not going to be good for tornado genesis with any supercells along them, usually in most cases.
Just a helpful piece of advice that I've always taken with me because when you have sessions like this, and we do have the replays so people can go back through and they can watch these on their own timing and try to soak in a little more information, take notes. I know that's how I learned, but one of the things too is I always try to take away like maybe one or two, sometimes maybe even three, like big points that I'm going to hammer into my brain that I'm never going to forget every time I listen to a podcast or a Convective Chronicles video or something like that, because good luck trying to remember everything. You won't on the first try. You're going to have to study. Right. But I think the one thing I'm going to take away from this session here tonight, Trey, is the speed of the outflow boundary being directly proportionate to the difference in temperature on the two sides, and really wanting to target those more subtle boundaries and really paying attention to how subtle that difference can actually be. And it can be easy to miss, especially if nothing is showing up on radar. That'll probably be the big takeaway from me when I'm chasing in the future, and something that I have not been paying a lot of attention to in the past.
Yep. That's really the main thing with boundaries. You need it to be slow moving or stationary, and that usually comes from how diffuse it is. If you have it like a cold front in the winter here, you have a big cold plunge coming down into the US. Well, that's a really strong temperature difference across the front. Usually you'll have 30s and 40s on the cold side, 70s on the warm side out in Texas and whatnot. And that front's surging fast. That's because there's such a strong temperature gradient across it. It's just crashing. You don't want that with your boundaries. You want a very diffuse boundary that's just kind of sitting there. Those are your optimal boundaries for tornadic supercells. And I guess with little time left, I'll just kind of fire off these last few tips I had, and then we can get to some final questions. But as far as some tips for targeting boundaries, you still do need some large scale forcing for ascent if your outflow boundary is diffuse. So if you have a really diffuse outflow boundary, you do need some sort of forcing for ascent. So we had a day this past year in 2025, it was a 10% in Oklahoma, as well as the day after the Silverton day. We had nice outflow boundary in Northwest Texas, but absolutely no forcing aloft. There wasn't any little shortwave moving through. You do need some sort of large scale forcing for ascent to allow updrafts that initiate along the boundary to take hold and actually reach their ceiling. So if you have just a boundary with no large scale forcing for ascent, that's usually not a great sign, and rarely works out. So if a boundary is diffuse on both sides, so basically it's baking during the day, you get sunshine and surface heating on both sides, you can get surface-based storms on the cool side of the boundary. And the storms may actually not be interacting with the actual boundary, but the air mass on the cool side of the boundary may have more backed winds and still good enough thermodynamics to support surface-based storms. And a good example of that was the actual Silverton day. I'll quickly show the radar for that here. So here's the radar for that. For the Silverton day, you can see the boundary very clearly outlined by the fine line, north-south oriented fine line. Storm motion was west to east, so automatically you might think, well, that's not great. But storms formed on the dry line back here to the west in hotter air. They then crossed the outflow boundary, which was moving to the west. But the air mass on this side of the boundary was more moist. Temperatures were a little bit cooler, so temperature dew point spreads were a little bit down. Still warm enough temperatures to support surface-based storms, and your winds were more backed. So you had stronger low-level shear with the terrain influence of the canyon and whatnot. And so even though the storms were not interacting with the outflow boundary itself, the southern supercell was able to become tornadic, even though it was on the cool side because it was tapping into that better moisture, slightly lower spreads, but still good enough thermos for surface-based storms. If you're targeting an outflow boundary storm, get to the storm quickly. These outflow boundary storms have a tendency to start producing tornadoes in low-level rotation very quickly, and they can. So always try to pounce early if you can. Get up right to that storm early on as the storm is developing, especially for landspouts as well. And then monitor the fine line location on radar of the outflow boundary relative to the storm or the hook echo of the storm. If the boundary starts surging ahead of the hook of the storm or the entire storm itself, the storm is likely undercut, and that's not great. And the storm's own outflow can shunt the outflow boundary away, leading to undercutting as well. So those are a few tips for you for outflow boundary targeting. But yeah, we'll take any final questions here. But yeah, hopefully you guys learned some new stuff. I know outflow boundaries are they're fairly easy to grasp, but hopefully you learned some new stuff from this. All right.
Yeah, that was me talking to myself with my speaker on mute. Trey, I was saying, I know you have a document that you typed up that you've been going off of. I've been following along with it as well. Should I maybe put that in chat for people?
Sure. Yeah, that works.
Okay. You guys, here were the notes on tonight's session. If you just want to keep them, look through them, maybe it'll jog your memory if you want to look back through and then match it up with something we were talking about in the replay session once that hits the channel here in 2 to 3 business days. Our moderator, Jack Kelly, says, ooh, outflow boundary notes. Yeah, good call, Ash. I'll put that in VIP right now. So let me go ahead and was a little disoriented, but there we go. And that is now in the VIP lounge. If you guys are wondering, the VIP lounge is basically like a general discussion area, but if you want to get away from all of the shit posters in the general discussion, I know it can get a little fast and furious. I definitely contribute to that from time to time, so apologies there. But VIP lounge is if you want to connect with other Academy subscribers, maybe have a more substantive conversation with people. And then I do see we have 2 people with their hands up, so we'll take these 2 final questions. We do have one last question as well that's typed out. I'm just going to give you that one first, and then we'll end on the 2 people coming up on the stage. Storm Chaser Radar Shark has a silly question. What do you think would happen if a storm produced 1,009 landspouts? Kind of a joke question. I would say more than kind of a joke question, but I'm very interested as to why you chose 1,009. Anyways, Trey, what would happen if there were that many landspouts being produced at the same time? Let's say along a massive transcontinental squall line that was reaching from like the border of Canada all the way down to Texas.
Yeah, that would be the longest outflow boundary ever. But yeah, I don't know what would happen. That'd be interesting. That would be a lot of chasers would be happy, I think.
It'd be like those reels that show up on Instagram where somebody's like, what if 1,000 gorillas fought 5 T-Rexes, and then it like simulates them through the like video game software that they
Yeah.
Okay, let's go ahead and bring Greenie back up on the stage. You can ask your last question of the night here, sir.
This is more of just a simple, it's basically just really simple. So, back in 2020, I had a funny little derecho event in early June. And after that, I had a pretty gnarly outflow-dominant supercell that would move through my area, which, isn't particularly uncommon with like northwest flow events, which usually drive the northeast storm season in the summer. But what interests me is that when I was looking at it again, I saw that there was like an outflow boundary kind of with storm breeze boundary that interacted with the storm as it moved over my house, which caused a very large spike in not only, general precipitation, but in particular hail, which, the storm did produce the biggest hail I've personally seen. So I was kind of interested on what in particular probably caused that when the storm took over that boundary and clashed with it.
Yeah, well, you have the extra uplift along the boundary, so extra juice for it. And then if the boundary was fairly sharp and you had cold air, it probably immediately went elevated. And as we know, elevated storms are pretty much best for large hail events because they're rooted above the stable layer. And then any low level shear that's in the environment kind of goes away, and you really have an effective hodograph that's pretty straight. So that is, I would guess that's what happened. It immediately increased in intensity because it hit the boundary, hit that extra uplift, and then immediately moved to the cool side and started producing big hail.
Moderator Jack Kelly says, damn, you basically broke every chaser's tornado count, referencing the 1009 Landspouts. And I'm just going to say, chat, say it with me. Trey, say it with me. Same outflow boundary, same tornado. So no, Jack, that's one tornado, even though it might be 1009 different Landspouts.
Sigh.
I see chat. See, I have a lot of people on my side now in chat. A lot of people are coming around to this idea. Okay. Last question of the night. Sanus Northeast Chaser, you are back up on the stage, my friend. Go for it.
Okay. I had this epiphany in the shower this morning. It initially came out of like curiosity. I think when I was looking at real high based significant tornadoes, I think I can remember the Marion, North Dakota tornado in particular. But this came to me when Greenie was asking about 3K. So I was thinking like it came to this idea like I think one of the big things might just be the LFC height. And I was thinking like, do you think it could be like what if you like measured the cape from like for a little bit above the you set up like a thing where you measure the cape from the LFC to a set height above the LFC, and if you like compared that from like the Midwest to the plains, do you think for a significant tornado day, of course, like if we're just gonna ignore all background factors like strong forcing, do you think that would be like kind of a valid thing in that like where the lower 3 cape on plains events might just be because of the higher LFCs?
So that's a really interesting point. And actually, if you guys know Marcus Reynolds from social media land, he actually messaged me with some work that he was doing exactly on what you said. And he was hypothesizing that and he was looking at Landspout events. Some Landspout events show pretty minimal 3 cape, but that's because they're really high base storms. So he was looking at, I forget the exact chunk of the atmosphere that he was looking at, but it was Cape from the LFC to some distance above the LFC, 2 kilometers above, or I forget the exact layer that he was using, but that was exactly what he was doing. So yes, I do think that may be a thing. Higher base storms in the plains, especially the central and northern plains, may not show a lot of 3 Cape just because bases are higher. The cloud bases are higher and the LFC is higher. So yes, I think that's a very novel idea that may have some utility.
All right, that sounds like an excellent question to send us off for the evening. It's been wonderful getting a chance to talk with everyone. Trey, learn a little bit more about outflow boundaries, and this was our biggest group coaching session yet in terms of active participants. So very awesome to see that the Chaser Academy is growing, and really appreciate all of you being here.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Hopefully you guys learned something about OFBs, some of my favorite setups to chase, and I'll be back in several days' time with another topic yet to be decided, but I'll try to make it interesting for y'all.
Have a good night, everyone. See ya.
See ya.